She took whippings at noon. Then, one sun-scorched midday in 1843, she made the mistress scream in front of everyone. The courtyard held its breath when the sound came, a thin, high thing that split the ordinary air. A woman's cry, sharp and unexpected, that landed like a stone on the marble of the veranda and sent rings of astonishment outward. For a moment the dogs stopped their whining. For a moment even the flies seemed to pause in mid-flight. Men who had not looked up from their wine stood straighter. Servants in the shade of the jacaranda froze with palms in soapy water. Outside the gate, the market hawkers swallowed a call. The coronel's gold-mounted watch stopped being mere ornament and became a compass for everyone's attention, its face reflecting the sun and the sound that had undone the household's usual order. She was Benedita. She had been 22 that winter, though the work and the quiet endurance showed in the small lines at the corners of her mouth and the particular stoop of her shoulders from years carrying wood and water. Her hands bore the map of her life, calluses like small pale coins, a whiteness at her knuckles where rope or handle had worn the skin down. She moved through the day like a machine of necessity, but inside that measured motion lived a fierce, stubborn insistence, a thing taught to her by a mother who had once said, "Over-boiled cassava and the thin coffee they kept for sacred mornings. Never lower your head." The phrase entered Benedita the way a stayed ember settles into coal, not loud, but enough to keep heat. The house, Donna Constanza's house, the Coronel Juan Batista de Almeida's household, was a place of ritual. It had been so for years, a neat choreography of power that used sunlight, silver, and the careful management of shame as instruments. Donna Constanza, the mistress, arranged her vanity as one arranges an altar. At dawn she sat by a small gilt mirror and tended to her hair with comb and oil until the room smelled faintly of orange peel and the smoke from the kitchen hearth. Her baths were a ceremony, warm cloths, a silver tankard that rang like a little bell when set down, the slow royal movements of a woman who measured her importance in cleanliness and the brightness of her jewelry. Beyond that private ritual lay the household's public economy of humiliation. The coronel carried authority in his boots and the set of his jaw. Men like Tomas, the fighter, wore cruelty as a uniform. He understood how to calibrate the lash to teach a lesson and how to time the slap so it echoed for months in a person's posture. The Cenzala, long, low, and close to the earth, housed the others. Lucia, with her soft laugh and quick hands, Maria, who kept the secrets no one spoke aloud, Isabel, who kept watch at the windows. Together they formed the hidden heart of the place, the buried current that sustained them all. Days followed a pattern that would have seemed to those born into that house, ordained by providence or habit. At sunrise, the kitchen's heat rose like a promise. By noon the sun pressed down. Chores quickened into a practiced rhythm to avoid the coronel's temper when he came home to inspect and to parade his comfort. The midday bath for Donna Constanza was always at roughly the same hour. It was at noon that Benedita's arms would be reddened from washing the courtyard steps, that her feet would know the map of cracks in the paving, that the silver tankard would gleam in the sun. It was at noon that discipline often was administered most theatrically. The courtyard cleared. The servants turned out like a gallery, the punishment set to show, a demonstration both of authority and of the cost of perceived disobedience. The Cenzala had its own rituals too, small sacred things held for themselves, a woman's smoothing of another's hair after a long day, the careful rubbing of a sore shoulder with warm lard, the sharing of a single dry crust of bread when wages were thin. Sometimes, in stolen evenings beneath a sky so spangled with stars, it felt like a separate country. The women would whisper old songs or share stories of places beyond the river where names were free and children ran without chase. In those whispers the words "never lower your head" were a litany, soft repeated, a vow. Older women would say it as if speaking to a child and a general at once. "Never lower your head," the chorus said, when fear tried to make them bow. "Never lower your head." The tarnished silver tankard was a small thing with the power of a bell. It measured more than water. It measured worth. On the day that became a wedge in the household's history, a faint smear marked the cup's lip, a speck of mud that could have come from a child's bare foot, from a boot, from the careless sweep of a servant's cloth. It was small, it was accidental, But for a woman like Donna Constanza, precision of appearance was a way of insisting on order. She saw that small spot, and it was as though a mark had been made on her own skin. Her face, usually composed like a cameo, tightened in a way that made the servants who watched feel the air change. Benedita had been the one to polish that set of silverware. Her hand moved on the metal with the kind of attention that made her proud in its workmanship. She had lifted the tankard to let the sun catch the pattern, had felt the coolness of the metal against her palm, had thought of nothing more than a job done properly. Maybe her cloth brushed a bit of dirt from her own sleeve and touched the cup. Maybe the outside sweepers tracked a line of mud toward the veranda. Whatever the origin, the spot was there. Donna Constanza noticed with a tilt of her head so slight it might have been missed by anyone else. She called for the one nearest her, Tomas, leaning with a cigarette in the shade, his eyes the color of old bark. He came forward with the practiced, slow obedience of a man who knew his place and how to use it to underline others. "What is this?" the mistress asked. The question had no tone of curiosity. It was the accusation of a court. Benedita stepped forward because practice had taught her to when ordered. She could not help but look at the silver cup, the small imperfection, the way the sun cut across the metal and made that one spot look obscene. Donna Constanza reached out a pale hand and touched the mark. Her nails were always perfectly kept. Even her small humiliations were attired. Then she did something that was as much ritual as punishment. She brought the hand down across Benedita's cheek, a slap with the flat of a woman's palm, precise and loud. It was not the first time Benedita had felt that white-knuckled indignity. She had been held like a slow furnace under the coronel's temper, had been put upon for others' jokes, had bent under the lash of a hand that meant to make her small. The memory of other slaps lived in muscle memory beneath the skin, in the way the breath tightened at the memory of approaching punishment. But the slap that day carried with it something else, the public show, the subtle preening of a mistress who wanted her servants to feel their place. The slap was the beginning of humiliation. The whip that followed was the ritual culmination. Tomas called for the trunk. It was an old thing, worn by use and sun, thick with the smell of tar and sweat. The punishment that would be meted there was not to be the coronel's own travail. He liked not to stain his hands with what he considered necessary domestic discipline, but it would be a performance sanctioned by his presence. Whipping was not merely pain there, it was theatre. The lashes would crack like a metronome and mark both body and the imaginations of those who watched. When the whip fell, the sound made an echo through the courtyard, a hard, brief percussion against the noon. No graphic detail marked the action. What mattered was the sound of it, the way it traveled, the slang of pain passing from body to body like a contagion. Lucia cried out low and suffocating. Maria turned her face until her cheeks were white. Isabel tightened her hand on the railing until her knuckles whitened. The coronel watched, his face an impassive coin. Donna Constanza watched with a small smile that did not fit the moment. The household learned its lesson. Afterward, bent like broken birds, they took Benedita back to the Cenzala. The women pressed cool cloth to the place where leather had cut into skin. They cleaned as much as they dared. No one spoke loudly. The language of the room was quiet ministrations and the soft intakes of breath. Benedita kept her jaw set. Her mother's voice returned to her, an old voice from simpler days, sharper now because it held no room for sentiment. "Never lower your head," her mother had said, and when Benedita felt the skin flash with pain, she felt something else rise too. A thinking mind, precise and cold as the river after flood. In the low breathing of the overnight aftercare, plans began the way they always did in the Cenzala, soft as a lullaby but steady as the plumb line. Lucia brought the news as though buttering bread, careful, unobtrusive. "She counted right on the noon," Lucia said. Maria rubbed a cloth across a tambour of thread. Isabel whispered about schedules like a woman reciting the hours of prayer. They mapped the household like a merchant maps known clients, where the coronel ate, when he rode out to check fields, the hour Donna Constanza took her bath, the way Tomas favored the far side of the yard at tea. The plan needed the household's small map, the rhythm of its vanity. They spoke of the mistress's bath as if it were a clock, each movement a tooth in a gear. It was heated in a copper basin that steamed fragrant with lavender and orange peels. The hot water lived near the fire that tended the kitchen. Someone kept the embers fed to ensure the mistress's bath ran warm enough, luxury in a house where many a worker washed in a single basin at dusk. The mistress paraded her comfort as proof of station. Benedita watched the ritual like a watchmaker watches gears, learning the precise time the water was hauled, the cadence with which the pitcher was set down, the way the mistress always asked for the basin to be placed within reach of the veranda's edge, where her own view of the house could be kept. This knowledge became a weapon. The women in the Cenzala suggested a plan with the sort of careful, almost mercantile calculation that made the idea seem less dangerous and more inevitable. It was not vengeance, they said. Vengeance was a story told by those who had nothing else. What they proposed was to hold a mirror up to the mistress's public display of shame, to return in one measured motion and with non-lethal force the intimacy of humiliation. If humiliation had once been taken to the courtyard with a whip and applause, then humiliation could be redirected by a simple act that would make the mistress feel exposed under the same sky. The idea was technical and required 3 hands beyond Benedita's. Lucia, Maria, and Isabel would play clear roles. Lucia would tend the fire and time the heating of the water, making the basin just hot enough to singe, but not to scar. Maria would be in the kitchen to direct servants and ensure no curious men came to inspect. Isabel would watch the gate and create a small diversion at the right time, so the doors were not too watched. Tomas's predictable stoic was crucial. He loved to parade authority in predictable stages. He always took a mid-afternoon walk around the open fields and stopped frequently to check the stables. Benedita knew his path like a line scratched into a palm. Beyond the logistics, the plan required a different kind of bravery, the harnessing of a public look. They intended not to harm beyond a memory, but to fracture the mistress's theatre, to make a woman who used ritual grooming as armor stand exposed, crying, in the center of the household's gaze. That scream, they thought, would act as a fissure. The coronel's image would be dulled. Gossip would circle. The household's blunt demonstration of power might begin to crumble under the shock that its own engine had been turned upon itself. Benedita held the idea quietly, like an ember cupped in both palms. She did not speak of flying or of leaving in that moment. She thought of the mother's voice again, how simple and utter it had been. The ledger of her days would not allow many illusions. She knew the cost of plans and the cost of failure. But she also knew how humiliation infected a room, and how public suffering could invert the line between those who looked and those who were looked at. For a week they rehearsed in small ways. Lucia practiced the timing of the embers so that the basin would be at the desired warmth at precisely noon. She learned the peculiar hiss that shallow hot water made when it first took the light of sun. Maria adjusted her duties so that the porches had an extra sweep at the hour that might look like mere care, but served to thin the courtyard's usual presence. Isabel took to carrying a basket down a near lane as though collecting laundry, and would at just the right moment let a child's ball roll into the yard and cause a harmless distraction. Benedita practiced the small motions she would need, the carrying of 2 buckets balanced at her hip, the slight turn, the tipping that would be only a tilt to the untrained eye, but which would deliver the sensation they intended. The thing had to look like an accident, an errant splash, so that no one could call it premeditated, and so that the mistress herself would register betrayal, not a community's prearranged spectacle. Timing, Lucia said the night before, tapping the rim of a bowl as if it were a metronome. Hold the water like a prayer, do not let it be a shout. Never lower your head, Maria murmured, a phrase that in the Cenzala both anchored and liberated. They chose their day with a kind of quiet certainty. The coronel would be away. Ordinarily he liked to visit his fields on certain market days, and maps of his habit were easy to read. Tomas would be leaning toward memory in the shade, likely to be away from the courtyard at the precise instant. The mistress's bath, as always, would be at noon. The world would be at the point where velvet of sun met heat. It was cruel, the cooking of vengeance to the hour when everyone thought of rest and most were within eyesight of the veranda. It was a cruelty they accepted as necessity. If humiliation had been organized against them, then their answer would be to arrange one small, decisive and public inversion. On the morning they chose, the air was already bright with heat. The kitchen hummed louder than usual with the extra attention to embers. Benedita rose earlier than usual to do what looked like ordinary tasks. She swept the courtyard, arranged the coals, carried the first bucket of water from the well. Her movements had the calm of someone whose mind was occupied but contained. The sun fell on her back like a hand. The silver tankard shone on the mistress's veranda as if nothing in the world could disturb it. As noon approached, the household settled into its familiar positions. Donna Constanza went about her ceremony, the soft clap of her fingers on towels like a conductor. She enjoyed the performance of being attended to. It validated a life built with careful repetition. She called out for the basin. Lucia, pretending merely to be a servant doing her duty, kept the fire fed a degree hotter than usual, so that when the basin was moved, the steam rose more sharply. Maria moved trays in such a way that observers would think only of good service. Isabel noisily chased a child's ball to create the small commotion that would draw eyes just so. Benedita carried the 2 buckets. They were iron, their rims worn smooth by years. She carried them with a practiced balance, an easy gait that belied the concentrated will beneath. The courtyard seemed larger than usual, every paving stone an eye. The midday light made everything too bright and every shadow too small, and the servants arranged themselves around the edges like pages awaiting instruction. Benedita felt the weight of the water, in a way she had learned to feel heavy truths, not to let them pull at her shoulders but to hold them steady. When she reached the spot near the veranda, the world narrowed to the sound of boiling, to the faint clink of the mistress's comb against a mirror. She paused, a beat only she would have known was a prayer, and then she tipped. The water found the mistress like a sudden weather. There was no rehearsal for a human body meeting heat. For a breath, Donna Constanza's face registered only surprise, a small, quick falter, and then a sound that she had never expected to make left her throat, thin and high and raw with the immediacy of pain. The scream that split the noon was not planned. The women in the Cenzala had intended a shock, a public exposure. They had not intended to hear the sound that came out of the mistress, a sound made by a body unaccustomed to such immediate unmasking. The scream was a revelation. It did what all public truths do. It rearranged priorities. Heads turned. Tomas, in the far shade, flinched as if someone had flung a stone against his ribs. The coronel's men, drawn by the sound, began to look up from yard and field. In an instant, the courtyard, that steady arena of display, became a place of raw exposure. The mistress clapped a towel to her skin, but the gesture looked impotent in the face of the household's gaze. A silence, thick and sullen, followed, then a scatter of voices, exclamations, commands, the small panics of those on the margins. Benedita did not shout or laugh. She did not throw her hands in triumph. She set the empty buckets down as if completing a chore. Her face was an unread map. Around her, the choreography the women had practiced began to play out. Isabel dropped an intended distraction and moved to the gate. Maria, with a show of gathering dishes, edged near the kitchen door. Lucia turned the embers as if to tend them. The act was precise and terrible and brief. It had the quiet finality of an answered insult. For a moment after the scream, the household was suspended in a constellation of reactions. Some faces were masks of outrage, not at the mistress, but at the affront to the social order. Others registered quietly the shiver of recognition, that a person in their midst had acted. Tomas's eyes narrowed with something that might have been calculation. The coronel's foreman, more a man of habit than imagination, barked questions that sought to catch the moment's meaning. Who had done this? What was the intention? The mistress herself, flushed and trembling, tried to reclaim her dignity by speaking quickly and sharply, as one does when trying to sound in control of something that refuses to be tidy. In the scramble, Benedita stepped back into the shadow of the Cenzala. The plan had been to create fissure and then fold into the hidden places. She felt the eyes of others on her as if they were weights, searching, accusing, perhaps even admiring. No one could say with certainty who had done it yet. The mistress screamed again, this time with more fury than pain, and directed a blind and furious gesture toward the nearest servants. "Who will answer me for this?" she demanded, voice stiff with offended property. Someone cried out, perhaps a child or a servant who had been a witness. Tomasz pushed forward, not yet certain whether to strike or to gather. The coronel's name was called by someone who sought immediate authority, no doubt someone from the master's own side, used to seeing him return from the fields like a judge who would not be delayed. The courtyard filled with noise. The dogs began to bay again. The house's brickwork seemed to close in as if the walls themselves were listening. In the center of the sound, Benedita felt a small piece of the world tilt. The mother's phrase sat in her like a coin, "Never lower your head." And for the first time she understood the meaning beyond posture. It was not merely a refusal to bow, but a decision about what one would risk to refuse bowing. No one came for her hands at that instant. The confusion favored the hidden. Lucia moved with a slow, certain grace to the place where Benedita stood, and with an expression that could have been tender or scolding depending on the second you watched, touched her arm. Their eyes met and 1,000 small things passed between them. Relief, apprehension, the knowledge that they had altered the household script, and not without price. But the noise hardened around them. The coronel's steward, an officious man with more loyalty to the household's reputation than to the truth, ordered the gates closed. Men began to fan out like nets. Tomasz barked at the servants to assemble. Donna Constanza called for a clean towel and an accusation. The mistress, still breathless, seemed to understand that her scream had done something irreversible. It had made the household witness a moment that could not be fully controlled. Her face, which thrived on being admired, now took on a different cast, the unaccustomed knowledge of vulnerability. Whispers began to snake through the yard and out beyond the gate. The market boys heard the scream and carried it to the alleys. The plantation hands in the fields felt the tremor in their mouths and began to guess at what might have happened. Within minutes, there would be talk, the kind that seeds rumor and fuels reprisal. The coronel would want answers. Tomasz would want the name of the offender. The household would brace itself for corrections that would be swift and punitive. For now, though, the moment hung. Benedita moved without haste toward the Cenzala, not running, for a run would have betrayed panic, but with the steady, measured gait of someone who had just completed the work her hands had made into a careful instrument. She passed under the jacaranda and its scattered shade, and into the dim of the sleeping quarters. Behind her, the mistress's cry continued like a broken music. Beneath it, the whisper of the women, the chorus, rose in an undertone, soft as moth wings. "Never lower your head," they said again, not as a command, but as a way to name what had been done. Never lower your head. Inside the narrow room, the voices were quieter still. The women made small practical decisions. Who would speak if questioned? Who would feign ignorance? Who would tend the mistress should she come asking in broken dignity for her basin back? They tended Benedita's hands as if to check for a burn, though in truth the marks mattered little compared to what the act had launched. Benedita sat cross-legged on the mat, her face lit by a sliver of afternoon light. She allowed the others to touch her and to fuss, and under their ministrations the tremor she had felt in the courtyard thinned but did not disappear. It had been a radical crossing. She felt both the uplift of having struck at an edifice of shame and the cold knowledge of what retaliation might bring. Night before dawn they would slip toward the river. They had arranged for permission, for all the small legal-seeming loopholes that could sustain escape. Joachim, known in the riverine circles as Mano, had promised the latitude of his canoe and the unblinking patience of the river. He had a face like weathered wood, hands like the paddles he used. He would take one extra fare beyond usual that week if the price were differently negotiated. Not coin, but the shifting of obligations, the release of a name, a secret watched of his own. But that belonged to the next hour. For now the household seethed, and the sound of the mistress's scream had reached beyond stone and garden. The coronel, at who knows which moment, would be informed upon his return. Tomasz would be given orders, the gossip would swell. In the Cenzala, lamps were lit to hide faces and reveal plans. The women, who had long known how to balance hope with caution, began to arrange the small details of a departure they had rehearsed with the care of those who know the two axes of risk, shame and reprisal. Outside on the veranda, the mistress wrapped herself in a towel like a child trying to regain composure. Her eyes held a new, startled understanding that public pain could not be fully claimed as proof of divine or human right. That realization contained for her not only hurt, but terror. The coronel's honor was a terraced thing. It held weight because everyone performed belief in it. The scream had pulled the cloth thin. Those who guarded the household's order would now press hard to stitch it whole. Inside the Cenzala, as the sun slid low and the jacaranda cast laddered shadows across the floor, the women murmured again the phrase that had become a hymn. Never lower your head. It was the sound of retention, of teaching passed down through small gestures. It was also a meeting of grief and triumph, both that a person could still rise to break the choreography of shame, and that doing so would almost certainly require price. Benedita rose to move through the darkening yard to check the buckets, to see if any coal still smouldered. She brushed her palms with a cloth, as if she were wiping away more than water. She looked once toward the veranda, where the mistress sat, and caught the reflection of her own face in the bright silver tankard, now set aside like a contraband relic. For an instant their gazes met not by sight, but by reflection, an image within the metal, and Benedita saw a truth she had not expected. The mistress's face, in the cup's curve, looked small and poor, as scarred as any brow. Benedita turned away. A barking voice rose near the gate. A horse clattered past in the direction of the coronel's office as a messenger, sent by someone eager to be first with news. The household's machinery began to move again, this time with the more dangerous velocity of those who repair ruptures by force. Men gathered. Questions were flung. Thomas counted names aloud as if inventorying broken things. The mistress soothed her own skin with cold water and cursed in a voice that carried to every person assembled. Someone did this. Someone would pay. In the secret room, Lucia placed a small sachet into Benedita's palm. A folded scrap of cloth, a little bar of soap wrapped in leaves, a coin not of much value but enough to buy a cloak should one need. For the river, she said, and Benedita understood the utter, slender magnificence of this domestic generosity. They had all risked something and shared in the provision for flight. Beyond the yard, beyond the gate, the rumor began its slow creep. The market would know by dusk, the neighbors would whisper before night, and somewhere, down by the river where Joachim kept his canoe like a thing of habit, the water waited patient and dark. For the first time in a long while the established order had been shown a chink. The mistress's scream had been the sound of that chink giving. It was a small rupture, perhaps, only a water's hiss and a human sound, but where one sound goes, others often follow. The household braced. Those who feared what might come would reckon with their fear by demanding names. Those who had helped plan the moment breathed in the precarious joy of having acted. Somewhere beyond the immediate spectacle, a future reframed itself, thin and uncertain as a line drawn in the sand. Benedita sat by the window as night gathered its first dark. She felt the sting of the household's attention like a weight behind her ribs. Her palms smelled of coal and lavender. Her mother's phrase, that stubborn ember, warmed her from within. Never lower your head. It had been a command. Now it was an inheritance she carried into the night, heavy as any cloak and yet light as any truth. Outside, a lantern passed by the gate, swinging like a little heartbeat against the dark. The dogs fell quiet. From the veranda, scattered orders flew. Beneath them all came the soft, persistent murmur from the Cenzala that had become the place where danger and consolation braided each other. Never lower your head. When Benedita rose to move toward the place where Lucia would be waiting with a cloak and a hand to steady her, she paused. In the courtyard, the mistress stood at the rail, rapt and trembling, a figure that had been shown to be like any other body under the sun, vulnerable to heat, to surprise, to the small accidents that make dignity fragile. Benedita saw for a breath how small and human the mistress looked. Then the sound of men's boots approached, a hard rhythm, and the present snapped forward again. The night swallowed the market's new rumor. The coronel's steward ordered men to the gate. Thomas sharpened his voice and his temper at once. Beneath the sounds of authority, the women prepared the quiet things that would enable flight, the folding of cloths, the passing of coins, the naming of routes. Joachim's canoe would be ready. The river would not turn traitor. But the world beyond the water was not yet within reach. They had made her scream. They had fractured a show. And in the hush that followed, the house tasted a new and dangerous air, the possibility that the theatre of power could be interrupted. The cost of that interruption still hovered like smoke at the hearth, a presence felt but not yet settled. The night that followed the noon scream moved with a careful electric hush. Lamps were muffled. Voices became cautious threads not yet ready to be woven into anything bold. Inside the Cenzala, the women moved with practiced stealth, folding shirt into shirt, slipping a scrap of bread into a pocket, sharing the weight of a cloak between two hands so that it would not bruise a shoulder when carried. They had learned how to make a small world of necessities take up as little space as possible. Each slow motion felt like a rehearsal for vanishing. "Stay with this," Lucia had said once in the dim, not as a command to the listener, but as a covenant to the group. Everything must look like the work of night. Benedita wrapped the cloth Lucia pressed into her palms around the shoulders that had borne the day's heat. The fabric smelled of smoke and orange, common, homey smells that could pass as ordinary if someone searched. She cinched the cloak tight enough to hide the faint pink of a painful place on her back. It did not matter if men could see scars later, only that now, in the dark, her form read as small and unremarkable. They moved past the jacaranda's shadow into the walled lane that led to the river. The jacaranda turned black against the stars, its leaves like the slow flapping of a dark curtain. Behind it, voices rose and fell in the house. Shouted orders, the mistress's muffled curses, the heavy footfalls of men assembling in their neat brigades. The women put finger to lips at each rumble of noise and pressed themselves into the deeper dark, as if the night itself might hide them. The path to the water opened like a secret mouth. Narrow, damp, alive with a thin chorus of frogs and the faint, leaky rhythm of frogs' throats. Joachim waited where the river kissed the bank, his canoe drawn up and half buried in reeds. He looked smaller in the half-light, a figure carved of weather and slow work. He had promised himself as much as he promised them, that the river would take what was given and leave what it could not hold. He did not ask questions about motives. Men like Joachim kept their silence as another kind of currency. "When will we know if the water's wide enough?" Benedita asked in a voice so low it might have been a portion of the reeds. She felt the question more as a check to her own courage than as a query for Joachim. Fear makes for small strategies that sound like questions. "It is wide enough tonight," Joachim answered. His voice was flat like a paddle scraping the canoe's side. "The tide does not rise too fast. The watchmen are bored and full of cider. The dogs will be heavy in sleep after day. Come now." The first bodies slid into the canoe as if they were shadow things, hands careful where the wood greeted the night. Benedita felt the river's smell, slick, deep, a smell like folded old cloth, and it steadied her as much as it stirred her. They bent low and let the reeds brush their shoulders, and Joachim pushed off with a stroke that made the canoe glide, as if it preferred the dark to the daylight. The crossing was not entirely without risk. Halfway across, some wind rose that made the surface glitter, like a scattered handful of coins, and lifted ripples that fumbled at the canoe's sides. At one point, a dog barked on the far bank, a single, startled sound halfway between alarm and the animal's private complaint, and for a moment, Benedita felt the world shrink to the width of that bark. Her breath hitched, and she placed a hand flat against the canoe's rim to keep from sliding. Isabel, beside her, hummed a low rhythm that steadied her. Lucia's fingers found Benedita's as if to give proof that fingers could be anchors. They reached the opposite shore with the sort of hush that makes any sudden sound an offense. Joachim hauled the canoe higher up the bank and fastened it to a sapling with a rope that smelled of tar. The women scrambled up, rubbing the dampness from their skirts as if the motion were amusement rather than urgency. The river bank beyond the palms and reeds was uneven, the soil loose with the footprints of animals and other people who had come for the water. They moved into that cover with the practiced ease of people who had for years learned to change the shape of their lives when the moment demanded. For a few hours they walked on bare feet over paths only the stars could fully see, through fields where the crops slept, and the earth kept its own secrets. They avoided any lane with a lamp. From time to time they paused when the owl called, or when the far lights of the village looked like eyes. Benedita walked with her head neither lifted too high nor bowed too low. Her mother's motto sat against her like a promise and a weapon. It did not tell her not to fear. It taught her how to hold the fear without letting it determine every move. Back at the plantation, dawn was not yet entirely woken when new sounds woke the household. The coronel, roused by an anxious servant, learned of the insult in a blink that removed whatever the previous afternoon had offered him, a sense of order. He cursed in the old, controlled way of a man whose authority feels scraped and raw. A messenger was set at once to ride to neighboring estates and to summon anyone who might be hired to help recover either person or reputation. Thomas, whose temper had been simmering since the water, took it upon himself to marshal men and to organize searches along known paths. He found in the possibility of reprisal a way to make his hands necessary again. Searches unfolded like patterns on cloth, methodical, earnest, practiced. Men with dogs scoured the riverbanks, riders swept through paths and hollows, neighbors were questioned in the sharp way of men who wished to be certain of their loyalties. The coronel offered what could be offered, a reward not measured only in coins but in favored labor, in the promise of exempting someone from a particular task in exchange for the truth. The rumor mill lent momentum to the call. Gossip widened the search outward. Someone said that a woman had been seen crossing near a bend. Another swore a canoe had pushed off into the dark. Each whisper was a hand turning a key in a lock. Each suspicion closed down some small space. Meanwhile, the Chancellor woke to a different kind of violence. The coronel, affronted where honor and display intersected, needed to make sure his house looked unassailable. He ordered increased labor from those who remained, and in the open hours the punishment was visible in plain, tidy manners. Extra tasks allotted like bills on a ledger, fewer rests, closer inspection at the water pump, an officer's watch along the washing areas. Thomas took these orders as permission to tighten his control. He policed the shifts as though keeping a ledger of offense and penalty. The first direct reprisals bore names that were small and unglamorous. A young man who had been seen loitering too near the river and who had a reputation for asking too many questions, an old woman who had lent a shawl to a traveler and received a scolding for it, even a boy who had been noisy at the gate and thus must have seen more than he said. They were punished not like criminals in a courtroom, but like irritants to a carefully curated order, sent to mend fences in the middle of the night, woken for additional labor, chastised in public so that the rest might fold in their fear. The violence was not always the kind that leaves a lasting mark on skin. Sometimes it was the kind that broke small privileges and rearranged ordinary comforts into scarcities. Lucia, Maria, and Isabel felt the pressure of these moves with a tightness like a cord drawn taut. They had known from the outset that someone might be blamed, and that those who were vulnerable would be first in line. There were nights when they lay awake, imagining accusations forming behind the coronel's tongue like a trap closing. In the small hours they checked on one another, traded stories of their childhoods to calm the present, and spoke of the plan's risks in the flat, factual language of survivors. They had not set out to be martyrs. They had set out to make a seam rip and see how the wardrobe beneath would look when stitched differently. Word spread in other shapes, too, the shape that favors rumor and not the ledger. At the market, a woman who sold beans told a cousin's cousin about a scream so sharp it made her cut her hand on a knife. Those who had never been near the house invented details worthy of spice. Some said the mistress had fainted and been carried, others that she had been burned so badly she would never show her skin again in public. The truth, always less dramatic, shrank under the pressure of embellishment. Yet among the fabrications there were also hints of truth, of a woman who had acted and then vanished, of a household scrambling like a boiler that had suddenly lost its lid. Benedita and the others pressed on, threading the nights and woods by paths only the hungry and the familiar would use. They reached a small farm where a woman named Donna Rita kept a bow of corn and pretended not to know what was past the gates. She gave them boiled cassava and let them sleep under a shed as though the rain might cover any footprints. Donna Rita had little official power. She had, however, a habit of storing kindness as if it were grain. She did not speak of what she did. She washed Benedita's feet and said with an economy that was an entire sermon, "Be careful with the moon. It shows what it likes and hides what it does not." As days folded into other days, news of the plantation's increased severity arrived even to the places where Benedita hid. A neighbor told of more patrols. Another whispered that the coroner had found a man who claimed he had seen shapes crossing a ford, an informant whose business it was to have made his life by selling impressions. The rumor hardened into the shape of pursuit. In the houses where gossip is currency, the coroner ordered bounties of loyalty and promised favors that made certain men brighter and more dangerous. For Benedita, the reality of being pursued transformed the feeling of movement into a new sensation, the sensation of a life divided by a line she could not cross back over. She slept less well when beyond the first few nights. Her thoughts, once neat and purpose-driven in their single thread, now braided with fear. Each rustle of leaf, each unexpected bird call made her start as if the sound itself could make men appear from pavements where none were. She held her breath often, and for long enough to make her head ache. Joachim, to his credit, kept arrangements with the kind of reliability that does not require many words. He would meet them at appointed places, a crooked fig tree, the shadow of a ruined wall, and he would ferry them a little further along the river, always with the same practical set of motions. The river tolerated these little violations, as one tolerates weather. It gave and it withheld according to a logic older than men's quarrels. Benedita learned to edit her gratitude into short, exact words and reserve whole sentences for herself at night. The coroner's insistence grew like a sore that would not scab. He rode out into the hinterland with men who meant to frighten the neighbors into speaking. He sent riders to speak with quilombos, rumored to lie beyond the wood for advantage. He offered coin and exemption from labor in exchange for names. The men who accepted his offers sometimes returned with nothing but promises and feverish imaginations. Their reports were thin as breath on a cold day. Others came back with the names of people who had once been seen near the river, or with second-hand rumors whose sources were sketchy and self-serving. The coroner's need for retribution, for proof, for someone to mark and make an example of, turned the countryside inward, so that suspicion became a way for neighbors to show loyalty by accusing someone else who might already be less favored. As the search widened, so did the variety of consequences. The Cenzala's quiet refuge was no longer so safe. Occasional raids were launched, and the house's guards checked bedding and trunks, turned cobwebbed corners with a speed that suggested they expected to find contraband and perhaps a person. The women in the Cenzala learned to tuck themselves into quilts, as if they were seeds being planted before frost. Benedita moved differently in the day, never in the line of sight of men who might note that she had been absent and then claim a memory as evidence. One afternoon, a week after the scream, a group of men arrived at the Cenzala under the pretext of searching for stolen items. Tomas led them, his face a strict line. They rummaged with practiced fingers. One young man was seized, caught because he had walked to the well at the wrong hour. The punishment meted to him was precise and public. He was made to work harder for weeks, to haul heavy loads with an insult attached to every motion. The women watched with faces that tried not to betray more than what was necessary to survive. Benedita kept her jaw hard and her hands steady. Each such spectacle she witnessed tightened a cord inside her, an understanding that action demands a price for those who cannot claim the currency of power. It was in those days of pressure that the story of the noon scream took on different coats of meaning, depending on who told it. In the market, the tale wore the colors of gossip, embellished and garnished for appetite. At the river, it was a tale of cunning and courage. At the coroner's table, it became a humiliation that demanded reassertion. Each telling changed the actors' faces and even the memory of what had happened, yet the core remained, and in tacked places the women kept repeating the same line, softer and softer, until it took on the texture of prayer. "Never lower your head," whispered old Gracinda at the market years later, as she packed figs into a basket for a child who asked about the woman who had made the mistress scream. She did not know for certain where Benedita had gone. She spoke as one who keeps a trust, rather than as one who gives news. In Gracinda's voice the phrase tasted of both warning and blessing. It told a child not to let fear be the final accountant of their sorrows, and taught that sometimes a body's stance can change the architecture of a household. Not all who knew Benedita celebrated the act. There were those who feared what would come, and feared ruin more than they desired change. Among them were men who had been friends once with Benedita's family, but whose own houses were thin of labor and who relied on the coronel's favor. They told a harder story of danger, of recklessness, of an action that had invited the house's fury upon the innocent. These accounts traveled quietly, spoken in the small rooms where men kept their worries, and they had the same effect as a silent hand on the shoulder. They made people look again at their choices. The coronel, burning for a remedy to his wounded honor, decided to use the law of the land as he had always used it, as an extension of his reach. He applied pressure to local authorities and to men who benefited from his patronage. He offered rewards of exemption from carriage duties and promised to sponsor someone's child for apprenticeship as a way of buying loyalty. Men who took his offers did not always find Benedita. More often they found lesser truths, the sorts of half-answers that the coronel's wrath could not satisfy. To compensate, the coronel tightened the plantation's rules to a near-oppressive perfection, a curfew for movement, an increased tally of chores, and the authorization for Tomas and his men to stop anyone wandering at odd hours. Under such pressure, the women who had planned the act had to make more choices. Some argued that remaining hidden in safer quarters might let the heat die down. Others pointed out that staying would entangle them in the coronel's reach, and that the suspicion alone could be enough to punish in other ways. They were forced into making strategic decisions. Who would keep moving? Who would remain as a decoy? Who would allow themselves to be questioned with a plausible story that could satisfy an inspector without naming names? In the end, it was not a single strategy, but a multiplicity of small acts that preserved them. A neighbor would hide a chest for a night. A young boy would carry a message past a patrol and pretend it was nonsense. A woman who owed the coronel a favor feigned ignorance at the market, while slipping a note of direction to those who needed it. These discreet acts formed a chain of small complicities that did not announce themselves as resistance, but functioned as it. Benedita, in the meantime, knew that she could not remain a permanent shadow. Her body needed more than secrecy. It needed possibility. The idea of a quilombo, an autonomous settlement where runaways and their descendants lived with more freedom, was not a certainty in anyone's head, but it was a point on a map of desire. There were rumors of one such place across a wide bend in the river, where a line of trees hid a community that had resisted capture for years by cunning, geography, and agreement with some of the land's rougher edges. The quilombo, in rumor, was less a place than a promise. Joachim carried them in that direction, and when the canoe crept into the bend where the river widened and the branches met like clasped hands, they all felt, in some private, unmistakable way, that they were leaving behind the frame that had contained them. The trees deepened and a sense of being under a different sky took hold. It was not yet safety, but the shape of possible safety lay ahead. They reached a place where small huts leaned close to one another, like people talking in low voices. Smoke curled up and the smell of cooking mingled with the river's damp breath. Faces peered and then smiled in a way that said, without much fanfare, "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." Benedita, for the first time in days, allowed herself to breathe, as if the oxygen here had been amended with permission. What happened next is threaded with the sort of ambiguity that stories keep when truth must protect its own. Some accounts say that Benedita was accepted into the community and given food and a place to sleep, that she learned to plant and to mend and found a new way to wear her hands. Others maintain she only spent a season there and then moved onward, trading one river for another, until her name disappeared from the ledger of daily life. A few more dramatic retellings, which the women in the Cenzala would scold as unnecessary embellishment, claimed she had been caught again and hauled back to the plantation in shackles. The only consistent fact was that no one could produce a certainty, and that, in the absence of proof, legends grew like vines across the old wound. Back at the plantation, remedies were applied in a fashion that mixed vengeance with the need to recover social capital. The coronel announced punishments that read like a catalogue of humiliation: heavier workloads, reduced rations, public lashings where a hand could be spared, and an intensification of surveillance. He made Donna Constanza attend fewer public functions and forbade her from parading her baths at midday. The mistress who once used ritual to stitch her authority into place now performed a more careful, measured pose. Her vanity persisted, but in a softer, more circumspect form. She did not appear where the world had once been invited to salute her. The household, for its part, felt both chastened and dangerous. Chastened because the house had been shown vulnerable, dangerous because the fear of what might happen next made the whole place edge toward sharper enforcement. Thomas, flushed with having extra license, grew sharper in his punishments. He moved through the Shenzala with a particular kind of coldness that made the women shorten their script of speech and keep their hands so busy that no eyes could say where they had been that day. He came with the kind of questions men like him are trained to ask, and when answers did not appear, he made sure that the consequences were a spectacle small enough to be humiliating, but public enough to warn others. He did this with a practical mind. Spectacle restored order in his metric for measurement. In such times, the household's equilibrium is a carefully rebalanced thing. More discipline, less play, fewer odd freedoms. From the outside, the coronel's efforts were a sort of theatre, authority rehearsing itself. But from within, these moves broke into the slow, interior work of grief. The women who had helped Benedita lived each day under a new calculus. Some found that neighbors shunned them for fear of association. Others discovered quiet forms of solidarity, an extra bowl of soup left at the doorstep, a child hidden overnight where a pair of adult eyes might watch him. The Shenzala continued in its small rituals, mending shirts, boiling coffee that would be poured into 2 small cups, telling stories to keep the edges of memory from fraying. Time did not heal the wound so much as turn it into legend. The noon scream became a kind of fulcrum around which other stories pivoted. Mothers told their daughters this narrative like a map to caution and pride. "Do not let them put you small," some said. "Never lower your head," others instructed as an incantation. The phrase moved into the fabric of community language with a flexibility that suited different needs. It was a talisman, a challenge, a comfort. Years later, in the market where old Gracinda sold figs and children pulled at her skirts, Benedita's name became one more token in a necklace of memories. Men who had been boys at the time of the incident told it in a way that made their young selves sound braver. Women who had been mothers remembered the way the mistress's scream had cracked the air with a sharpness that reordered the day. Some said Benedita had crossed the ocean and found a life in a city whose name no one could agree upon. Others kept the quieter belief that she had lived freely for some seasons, and then disappeared into the slow work of life, the sort of vanishing that is neither triumph nor tragedy, but simply the human habit of moving on. Across the years, the coronel's name weathered too. He remained in his house and performed weathered power in the same stamped way, but travellers who passed by later sometimes mentioned that the household's splendours had less sheen. Things had been tightened and varnished into something less generous. Donna Constanza's garments were still elegant but measured. Her baths were less of a public ceremony and more of a private consolation. Thomas found promotions and rewards that made him secure in the coronel's present regard. But his eyes acquired a small, taut hardness that loneliness can give those who build their lives by browbeating others. The legend of Benedita grew in the small various ways legends grow, contradictory, useful and alive. At evening gatherings, women would sing versions of the story that emphasized different parts. One elder would linger on the taste of the water and how it struck the mistress. Another would instead linger on the clean efficiency of the plan and point out the brilliance in ordinary hands. Children learned the tale early on as if learning a geography of courage. There are spots where shame is administered, there are counters to it. The refrain, "Never lower your head," became less a motto and more a communal beat that stitched neighbors to past acts of rebellion. Certain moral complexities remained with the telling. Those who had assisted Benedita paid in varying degrees for their choice. It would have been dishonest to present the act as costless. People lost small pleasures, gained suspicion, and weathered the coronel's attention. Some lost more than comforts. A woman who had been reluctant but who had nonetheless sheltered a cloak was later forced to leave the area, striking out to find work in a humbler place. Men who had lent boats or hidden tracks were sometimes fined or called upon for odd labor. Their reputations, like the coronel's, changed. The act of striking back at the mistress did not exempt the actors from suffering. It only redistributed it in modes that did not all point to triumph. And yet there was a kind of dignity that could not be measured in the ledger of losses. Benedita's decision, whether its final location was the river or a farther horizon beyond most people's maps, shifted something small and stubborn inside those who had looked at her and seen the possibility of refusal. The dream of a life not measured by other people's tolerance kept seeds alive. People who had crouched low to keep from being seen found in her action a permission to consider facing the sun. The story's uncertain ending became part of its power. Ambiguity kept it alive. If she had vanished into a quilombo, her name was a safe haven to invoke in a world that counted eyes and breath. If she had moved further away and sown a different life, then the tale was proof that movement and reinvention were possible. If she had been captured and punished, the story was a reminder that justice seldom waits on the scales men carry. Each version served an audience's needs and preserved a piece of truth, the truth that someone had refused to accept shame's choreography. In the small houses by the river, older women would begin their tales by lowering their voices and leaning in the way people do when sharing a sacred thing. At noon, the courtyard stopped breathing, they would say, borrowing the metaphor that had once been a literal sense in the house. Children would widen their eyes. Young people who had not lived through the day would nod as if learning the laws of behavior in their country. The phrase, "Never lower your head," would be the last thing spoken, an echo that left the air heavy and steady. The scream had been a fracture. The act had been a blade soft with water and resolve. It did not end tyranny in one blow. It did not create a clear hero. It did not remove the coronel's power. But it did shift the field of what was possible. It made conversation and rumor and memory carry an ember that might one day start a more durable fire. For those in the Cenzala who had held the plan like cupped coals, their choice remained a thing of consequence, a decision measured in nights without sleep, in lost favors, in the risk of being named. Yet the price did not erase what they had done. A public show of power had been forced to confront a public wound. Years later, when the new generation learned the story, they would sometimes ask what exactly had happened to Benedita. The older women would look at one another and smile the small smile of those who know that some answers, if given too plainly, take away hope from a child. Some say she found a place where she could wash her own feet without being seen, one would say. Some say she rode toward the sea. Some think she took a husband and a small field. The details changed as needed. The repetition mattered more than the facts, and the refrain, soft, stubborn, unstoppable, kept being passed on. The finality of the story was not a tidy ending, but a continuation of living memory. The noon scream, then, was less a single event, and more a hinge on which numerous stories rotated, each one offering a moral in a different key. It taught that dignity is sometimes reclaimed in a single precise motion, that solidarity is a braid of many hands, that cost is never absent from the work of breaking a routine of humiliation. If you stand now at the river where the canoe once glided, and listen while the wind shapes the reeds, you may hear remnants of the old choruses in the way people speak of courage there. Not as headlines, not as a clear victory, but as a whisper that tells those willing to hear it. Hold your gaze when it matters. Refuse to be made small by the rituals of another. Never lower your head, the river might say, if stones and water had voices. That line, half command, half blessing, became a living thing, one that kept the memory of a woman's action breathing in the mouths of those who came after. If this story moved you, pass it on, tenderly, faithfully, so that the memory of those who struck back at public shame remains alive in the speech of ordinary days.